So now I'm going to ask the four of you to come up and join me over here on the stage for a conversation with all of you and the four of them. And I'm, as Jim O'Hara would say, I'm going to channel my inner Ellen here. She's way better dressed than me. And I'm going to plop myself down here. So some of you've got little pieces of paper, and there's volunteers that are going to come down the aisles and pick up the little pieces of paper. So if you want to just pass them down, and we'd be really happy to. These chairs are so deep. I left my notes here. So first of all, I want to thank all four of you for sharing your experiences and your wisdom and your insight. I know I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to sit and share and express some of your deepest learnings and insights and thoughts. So please keep the questions coming down. I'm gonna start. We've actually had a few people submit their questions online. People who either weren't able to be here this evening, or people who just for various reasons submitted them in advance. So I'm gonna kick off with a question that was submitted a couple of days ago by, actually a similar question that came from two people. And it's really about your experience in the workplace. So how can our workplaces be more supportive? How do you find peers react to, in particular, I guess for you, Erin, and for you, Erin, sorry. How do you find peers react when you disclose or it becomes known that you have a mental illness? And how do you, what would you suggest that organizations, corporations, businesses, and employers can do to really make our workplaces more healthy, more accepting, and more inclusive of people who are struggling with mental health, mental illness, and substance use issues?
I have an amazing team. Some of them are here tonight to support me. I can't express how much just acceptance I've found there. They even get it when I joke about it. I can make them laugh. With my clients, I introduce myself and I mention my mental illness, where it's led me in hospitals and things like that. And I've had every response from my peers, our clients, from really, that's cool, to, oh, you take meds, to, you schizoid nut, the whole range. But on my team, I have not had one person make me feel that I am less than any other person on my team. And I really thank them for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think at Rain City, as an organization, does pretty well to fight stigma around what gets called mental illness. But I also think we also have a lot of work to do. Like, a lot of these ideas are pretty deeply ingrained in us. You know, like, are people more unpredictable, or, you know, like, more violent? We know this stuff is untrue, but I think that some of the messages in our society embed them pretty deeply. So one of the strategies we're doing is creating more peer specialist positions across our agency, which allows people to be out about their experiences. Because I think within this sector, and especially in the nonprofit sector, like, a lot of what drives people to this work is some lived experience around these struggles. And then we get told to be very quiet about them, and I think that's really problematic.
Catherine or Stephen, did you want to add anything?
I think similarly, I think we have lots of folks with lived experiences within our health system in the same way as we do in our nonprofit. It's just not talked about. I think, and it's not, we're working on ways to help people learn to use their own vulnerability and their own story as a part of their care, and to shed the mask of the institution and bring in the humanity of Steve, but that doesn't come naturally. It isn't taught in schools, and it's something that supporting our system to feel vulnerable and to acknowledge that it's not perfect and it couldn't be perfect are started some of the conversations that we're now having. You know, talking about the trauma of seclusion, we're now starting to have the conversations about the folks who are having to, part of their job is to contribute to seclusion, and talking about the trauma of that, and then labeling it that from both people is starting to change the dialogue. So I see huge change. don't know if you have anything to add.
Just a really quick piece. There's a Guarding Minds program that is available. It's part of the Psychological Health and Safety Standard that the Mental Health Commission put out a couple of years ago now. And I think the notion around creating psychologically healthy workplaces is a really important one. So it's not just, physical health and safety, and that idea that if the workplace is psychologically safe and healthy for people without mental health or substance use issues, or who currently don't have those things going on in their lives, it brings up the bar for everybody. And so would really encourage people to look at the Guarding Minds program. It's online and free, and allows organizations to think about creating just mentally healthier workplaces in general.
Okay. A couple of people, what I'm doing is sort of grouping the questions. Some people have asked similar questions, so I'm sort of grouping them into similar questions. A couple of people have asked about the media as a form of structural stigmatization. I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts or comments about the role the media can play that would, either the issues that you see that are problematic, and from a more positive perspective, what the media can and could be doing that would be turning that on its head and using it as a force for good.
If I can jump in first. There's a social planner named John McKnight. He lives in Chicago, and he talks about engaging the media and helping them to look at their portrayals of poverty and mental health and substance use like the way that we portray the business section of the newspaper, as opposed to the editorial section of the newspaper. And really focusing on giving the facts, giving the ups and the downs, and really trying to look at why is it so different from the business section of the newspaper. They also, John McKnight worked, I know, in Toronto with the 3 big newspapers around understanding the devastation that's caused by marketing misery, and trying to make an agreement amongst the media and amongst the nonprofit sector who tend to fall under that category, to try and raise the bar for the way that they describe their work, the way that they describe misery, and only one side of the post-traumatic barrier, one side, the fragmentation side, and not the grisdom, it's not a word, the grit and wisdom side of the spectrum, the grisdom side. Yes. A new phrase.
I know that often the media can portray the uncommon times when someone with a mental illness has committed a crime, and they don't publish that a person with mental illness is actually many, many times more likely to be the victim and not the perpetrator.
It just makes me think of part of the At Home project was a Speakers Bureau, and Aaron at Rain City took the Speakers Bureau over at the end of the project. But one of the things we did
I think we partnered.
We partnered on. But one of the things that the people who were all participants in At Home talked about was very much those issues of wanting to influence how the media thought about and talked about and people. And so, still we have lots of people, including people within our system, who talk about the mentally ill and the homeless. Well, people are homeless in transitional ways. And even within our project, you'd have people who've been housed for a year and a half, and we're still referring to them as the homeless participant. I mean, so kind of unpacking those things about how we describe people. And we brought in Lori Cuthbertson from the Vancouver Sun to meet with the Speakers Bureau to talk about, from her perspective, how complicated it is at times to portray or to talk about mental health and substance use issues and other issues, and from the people with lived experience in the room, for them to kind of communicate to her about preferred ways of talking about and writing about people.
Yeah, just to echo that, I think we need to encourage media to come up with deeper descriptions of people. Like, someone having a mental illness says actually very little about who they are as a human being, so anything we can do to encourage richer descriptions of any marginalized group, because the media carries stereotypes about lots of different groups of people. And to echo what Catherine was just saying, I remember having a conversation with a couple of young men a few years back who had housing, and they kept referring to themselves as being homeless. And I was like, you're not homeless, but it's become a type of person, and it's not. It's simply not having a house.
Okay. Keep your questions coming down. You can just put your hand up at the end of the aisle and the volunteers will come down and get your questions. We've got lots of questions here. It's going to keep us going for a little bit. We've got about 10 more minutes. So we've had a couple of questions around the whole area of involuntary hospitalization. And I think, Erin, your brave comments really struck a chord for several people here this evening. And so a couple of people have asked, what can care providers and the system do to minimize the trauma while still providing that life-saving function during involuntary hospitalizations?
Despite all my bad experiences, I do believe that there's a place for involuntary treatment. I don't believe it should be as harsh as it is, but I think one thing it needs to address is how many nurses, how many care providers are there at a time able to help people. The last time I was in the hospital, and I was in the mind space of the rats and trying to get them out, and one nurse took 45 minutes, just sat with me, and I don't actually remember this very much, my friends told me about it, but took 45 minutes just to calm me down with her voice and a touch on the shoulder or keeping my head safe. And that really differed from a lot of my other experiences, but it was really good to see. I think I've been out of the hospital for a number of years, and I think it is actually changing to having more people willing, and then we need to have the structure of them able to take the time to react to me as an individual, not just a schizophrenic who needs to be restrained, but as a human being.
We have initiatives to try and support understanding that that's a trauma for both the staff and the client, to realize that the power of the human connection to draw people back up. Even labeling it a trauma is a new thing. Labeling it violence, using violence to treat health, helps people to understand that it may be considered a necessary, but it's not a pleasant for anybody involved, and that it isn't benign. It's a trauma, another forced change in the perspective, and that it needs to be debriefed and reconnected. And trauma with support creates resilience, it creates grit, like I talked about. And each time we perpetrate trauma, that is a forced necessary opportunity to reconnect and to reestablish safety and to reestablish that I'm a human and you're a human. It's not a patient and a professional. It's a human and a human trying to do good together. And just labeling it that and allowing people to go through that and allowing staff to grieve as well as clients, allowing family members to understand it. Just allowing this idea that it makes all of us vulnerable because we're all earthlings.
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 Phew. Is everyone here an earthling? Catherine or Erin, thoughts or comments?
I think this is another assumption. We assume that people don't seek help and therefore we have to impose help. And when we actually looked at the people, and that was very much the story for many of the people that we were working with in At Home in Vancouver, and when we actually worked with VCH to unpack that, the reality was quite different. People had sought help multiple times. Their files had been closed because they didn't agree with the service, or they didn't show up on time, or they came in under the influence of a substance. But it's not that people don't seek help, it's that help doesn't receive them and doesn't work with them. And so there are many strategies to reduce the number of involuntary hospitalizations that are needed, and that's around early psychosis kinds of approaches and working with people when they come seeking help, not assuming that they're looking for attention, but in fact taking them quite seriously in the first instance. And so there's a bit of a shift, I think, that it won't eliminate the need for involuntary hospitalization, but it would probably dramatically reduce that being the first entry point for many people.
And I was going to echo what you said again. I think that we need to understand how serious it is to take away someone's liberty, and I think that people within the system do, but that we've got an upstream problem of not providing services and the right services fast enough to people, and particularly trying to fit people into broken systems or fit people into systems at all, rather than fitting the system around people, which I think we need to do a lot more of, asking people before they're really unwell, what we can put in place.
Okay. We've had a really interesting and thoughtful question there's a couple questions that are really actually around one of the structures that we have, and that's family. And I know lots of us who are here tonight are either here as someone with lived experience or someone in your family who's experienced mental illness. So I'm going to start by reading you the comment that came online from, I think, someone who's here this evening, and then sort of transition that into a question that each of you, I think, can offer different perspectives on. The 11th of May is my daughter's 46th birthday. I will celebrate it by being among you. She is currently in a 2 to 3 week process of discharge planning from the Royal Ottawa Hospital. It's been upwards of 15 years since she was diagnosed with schizophrenia and substance abuse. How do I break the grip of fear that renders me almost incapable of talking to her about it? She doesn't want to, and I don't know how. So what is the advice you would offer to family members? And what are the resources in the community available to family members who want to help and don't always know how?
I guess I can start. I am a family member. My brother was diagnosed really early on with bipolar and alcoholism, and involuntarily treated for a number of months when he was 14, and continued to struggle with some or all of those things for a while. My husband's brother has schizophrenia, and 2 of our nephews have psychosis and substance use issues. So, like probably many people in the room, lots of connections to people who have struggled. And I think, the main thing that I talk to people about when they ask me as a family member is to remember to come alongside people and to never lose hope that recovery is possible in a whole bunch of profound ways. And being able to articulate how scary it is to walk alongside somebody and to watch them make decisions that maybe seem like not the best ones, but to stay present and to trust in the deep and profound resilience that exists in all of us, and to try to communicate that in as many ways as you can.
I'd say don't go it alone. The antidote to all of this is connection and community. And so to find in inspirational stories, other families, other things, living connection with living connection, living connections with living things would be my antidote. And in all things, just keep connecting on whatever that means, whatever that level that means. Hell is being alone and isolated in solitary confinement. And that's what we want to do the opposite of.
I really feel for my parents, because when I'm ill, I just utterly reject them. I push them away. And it was easier to do that because I was here living on the West Coast, and they were back in New Brunswick where I was raised. And I would barely answer them on the phone. If they wanted to visit me, I'd say no. And I just don't know how hard that must have been for them. I'm just at a loss to know how I could have helped them help me. My biggest communication to them has been through my book. They've both read it. My dad does tell me he's very proud of me, and he listens to interviews I've done or reads articles I write. And the last email he gave me this morning was, "Love, proud dad." And I'm so glad that I was able to get the treatment, and the involuntary treatment that I talked about literally saved my life more than once. So I'm just so thankful that a system could bring me to the point of letting them in again and letting them support me again.
Yeah, just say the importance of keeping connections, even if you have to be boundaried at points in time, and maybe that connection looks different ways. I think it's so important to keep that there, and that and to realize that recovery is possible, and to be hopeful for people, and then also not to to really acknowledge that the system isn't supporting families well either, right? So it's not, we don't want to get into a whole bunch of parent blaming too about the outcomes of people, because there's so many factors that and make people struggle in the world. That's, you know, so I think the parents can wear a lot of that, and I don't think that that's fair.
I think also believe that person has gifts to give, you know, and that there's contributions there if the opportunities are enabled, both for the family to give to other families and that human being who's hasn't had the opportunity to blossom, right?
Okay, I'm going to shift. We got time for a couple more questions, if that's okay. Great question. Somebody says, how do we keep the hope, the conversation, and the goals of Housing First alive? When we're not in Regina, we live in Vancouver, which is a very expensive, tight housing market. So how do we take those principles that you so beautifully showed us up on the slide, Catherine? How do we keep that spirit, that conversation, those ideas resonant in a city with a very challenging housing market to achieve a policy goal like that of Housing First?
It's probably the gazillion-dollar question, but I think one piece is to really participate nationally and provincially and locally to sort of demand more investment in affordable housing, because that's sort of setting the bar, and so I think that's a really important first step. And then I think as family members and people who maybe are struggling with finding housing, who've experienced homelessness or mental health, substance use issues, that sort of mix of things, to remember that even in a scarce environment of scarcity of housing, that the housing that's offered doesn't define who you are, and that other options are possible. It might be and the other thing we found from across the country is, you know, landlords are people too, and landlords have family members, and landlords have people that they love who have died because of homelessness or mental illness or substance use. And even though there's, you know, a 1%, I don't know what it is now, vacancy rate, there's always market units available month to month, and some of it's being creative and actually believing it's possible and seeing what can happen, as opposed to just kind of, because it was a pretty tricky market when we started, and that was true in a number of the other cities. So yeah, that's a long answer, sorry.
I can give another anecdote.
Sure.
That's I think it's a Rain City anecdote. It's the 39th and Fraser building that started out as a community opposed project, and where they didn't want to have this building with mental health and substance use, and the work of the staff and the tenants all working together in that community transformed it from being you know, that classic, we don't want it in this neighborhood, to an asset to the neighborhood, and really viewing housing and having the opportunity to have people with disabilities in our housing as an asset to a housing, as an asset to a community, really seeing it as a gift as opposed to something that we have to tolerate. And that what that does is it starts to have us start to think about opening up all sorts of avenues, breaking down all of the disabilities, and just changing the way we view people. And that, I believe, will start to open up people to open up their houses, open up their basement suites, open up different things to different people, really realizing that they can be assets to communities. It's a wonderful case study from Rain City, where they went from the scarlet letter to the concept of all the tenants wearing a special jacket when they left their rooms, to a place where they were controlling the Business Improvement Association's block parties, and really seen as a real asset to a community, which is not something that we think of when we think of building housing for people with mental health and substance use. But it's a real live case example in Vancouver, worth looking into.
Okay. You don't have to say something.
Okay, good.
You can just say,
Yeah.
pass. It's okay. So can I ask one more question, and then we'll I think we'll wrap up, right? Yeah. I'm wondering if you all bring years of insight and experience and lived experience and professional knowledge and insight. But I'm wondering if just in a personal way, you could offer up a hope, an offering for what we can be doing individually and as a community to be overcoming stigma. What's one thing we could be doing as a community differently than what we're doing now? Don't all rush to answer that one.
I think using your voice. So for many years, I didn't talk about the people that I loved who were experiencing mental health and substance use and related issues because I was ashamed, because I was scared. The minute you start talking about the people that you love or yourself, people come out of the woodwork because it's such a relief. And that's true of many of these forms of dislocation. So I would just encourage people to use their voice to speak their truth and their about the people, about themselves, and about the people that they love who continue to struggle.
That's what I'm trying to do by saying to whenever I speak, I have a mental illness, and giving details. Like this morning, Global TV wanted to advertise this event, and so I was on there. And so on Global TV, I said, I used to believe I had rats living in my head eating my brain. And just being willing to tell my story, not for my story's sake, but because every time I speak, I hear from other people who said, thank you for being a voice for me. I have a mental illness as well. And I want to just show by example that we can talk about these things, and we have to. We have to.
My answer was, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
So.
I think I'm just really being thoughtful about how intersections of oppression make people more vulnerable. Not necessarily, but can make people more vulnerable to having to go through systems that might not work for them. And I think just being really kind to people who might be different than you when you're out in community is really important.
I think for me, whenever you start to generalize or stereotype or ism people, that's your opportunity to challenge yourself to look at why are you doing that? What are we afraid of? What is it in our own story that's getting in the way of understanding people as individuals? And so all of the isms are grounded in trauma, I think, and are grounded in fear. I also think I do far more for people with mental health and substance use issues outside of my work when I'm talking about it at a coffee shop or at the gym or, than I do in the work that being up here. And that's something I think all of us, we can take on that role that it is going to take all of us in little gestures at coffee shops and when we're walking down the street or in casual conversations.
Maybe really understanding that people's behavior makes sense. Like it always
it's
makes
logical.
sense. Like
It makes sense.
Might not within your own context, but it makes sense within their context. So, I've met people before who, they'll yell really loudly on the street, and you might walk by them and think they look crazy, right? But it's actually a brilliant strategy to keep yourself safe when you're really vulnerable and you don't have a home, because it keeps people away from you. So just people's behavior makes sense.
It makes sense. And it'll change when situations change, when safety comes back.
Yeah, like when we were working with folks who've been outside, and then we moved them inside, we have to learn inside behaviors rather than outside behaviors, but it all makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Erin, Catherine, Aaron, Stephen, thank you. On behalf of all of us, thank you.